Привет, меня зовут Саша Стерник, и я глава новостной команды волонтерского издания «Мезузе». С началом войны 7 октября Израиль столкнулся с огромным количеством проблем и угроз. Кроме очевидных вещей, которые испытывают все люди, которые находятся сейчас в нашей стране, непрекращающиеся сирены, атаки и перехваты, к которым мы все уже привыкли, есть еще одна проблема, о которой мы много говорим, но недостаточно думаем. Международное сообщество осуждает Израиль. Кажется, что сейчас это транслируется примерно всеми, от политиков до общества, до международных организаций. Однако важно помнить, что у Израиля все еще остаются друзья. С одним из таких людей команда Мезузе решила сегодня поговорить. У нас в гостях британский офицер, полковник в отставке и ветеран войны в Афганистане и Ираке, Ричард Кемп. Полковник Кемп является военным экспертом и давним другом Израиля, и сегодня мы решили поговорить с ним про то, как видит ситуацию человек со стороны. Полковник Кемп очень часто дает интервью разнообразным СМИ и медиаресурсам, он много говорит об Израиле, он много говорит об антисионизме и антисемитизме, и это то, о чем мы с ним сегодня поговорим в том числе. Мы много говорим о том, что надо делать, что уже было сделано, и про то, что надежда еще есть. И я очень надеюсь, что вам всем будет также интересно посмотреть запись этой беседы, как мне было интересно разговаривать с полковником Кемпом. Это команда Мезузе, и мы начинаем. Colonel Kemp, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you here. I understand that the last 5 years of your military career were spent at Downing Street as the head of an international terrorism team at the Joint Intelligence Committee. As such, considering your previous experience, how much would you say is the current situation influenced by the decisions made in the early 2000s?
The situation in Israel today is not in a vacuum, as Secretary General of the UN Guterres said, but he referred to something different. He suggested it was actually Israel's fault, and he talked about illegal occupations and so on. The reality is that the situation we've got today is a result of decades of indoctrination of Palestinian civilians in Gaza and in Judea and Samaria, also known as the West Bank, to hate Israel. And people have grown up over many, many years to hate Israel, and that's where the Hamas get their recruits from. These are the sort of decisions, a refusal to accept any kind of life of peace alongside Israelis by the leadership of Palestinians. And on top of that, of course, you have Iran. Iran has got its hand very firmly behind this attack that took place on the 7th of October, as it has behind everything Hamas does, Islamic Jihad and Hezbollah up in Lebanon. And so you have to look at the history of Iran's machinations in the regions, particularly using proxies all around Israel and inside Israel to attack Israelis.
You actually mentioned something that I'm personally very interested in, which is indoctrination, because the news team of Mezuze was actually invited to see the, I wouldn't call it film, but the depiction of what was happening on 7th of October on the Black Sabbath. And we saw a lot of people who were not wearing any type of military ammunition, who were not wearing body armor, anything like that. They looked like they were civilians. And to be honest, that was one of the scariest things. Obviously, I'm not trying to downplay the casualties and everything else, but to see so many people who were just blinded by the pure hatred because they were indoctrinated, because we're seeing so many things being taught to those kids who were not born like that, because every child was born innocent. And I'm genuinely interested and hopeful to learn what could we do to change the situation from the indoctrination perspective, because what's happening is horrendous.
I saw that film as well, and it's a film that I wouldn't wish anybody to see who didn't have to. It was absolutely horrific. So many horrible things in it that are almost beyond description, and I wouldn't want to describe them now. But two other things, apart from the horrors, struck me about that film. One was the pure joy of the killers as they tried to hack people's heads off, as they murdered people, shot people, tortured people, and raped people. the pure joy on their face. It's something I haven't seen before. I've seen plenty of terrorist acts, but not carried out with the sheer pleasure that those people carried out those acts. And the second thing that struck me about that film was the military organization of the terrorists. They were well organized, well trained, well equipped, and that is not some group of terrorists out of Hamas, out of Gaza. That is an organization that's been trained by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, an organ of the Iranian state. And those two things were very striking. As to your point about the civilians, my understanding is that many people, after the Hamas killers came in, many Palestinians flooded across the border into these communities in Israel and looted and damaged and destroyed anything they could have, anything they could find. They took flat screen TVs, fridges, people's personal possessions. They took, and sometimes in horse and carts, took back across into Gaza. And these, in some cases, I'm told also, are civilians who worked within the communities inside Israel. Inside some of the communities, they looted themselves. And that tells you something. These people were paid vastly more than they could ever earn inside Gaza by Israelis in these communities. Yet they still, when it came to it, turned on them and stole from them. So I think that tells you a lot about this indoctrination, this anti-Israel hatred. And the indoctrination is not just restricted to Gaza. It's just the same in the areas administered by the Palestinian Authority. And school textbooks, films, speeches, everything that is given, everything that is delivered by the Palestinian Authority to children in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria, and also in Gaza, is shaped at demonizing Israel, demonizing Jews. Now, when you've got that, people then talk naively about a two-state solution. How can you have a two-state solution with people who are bred to hate the people you're supposed to be living beside? So that it has to start from there. And one of the problems that we have is that a lot of the textbooks, a lot of the material, the educational material, a lot of the propaganda generated by these people is funded by our taxes in the West, funded by the EU, funded by the US, funded by other countries. And that has to stop. It has to be, it's not a process that can happen overnight, but it has to be stopped somehow. And the first way to do it is to cease funding these textbooks.
How many years, how many generations do you think will have to go for us to change the situation realistically?
It's a long-term process, but I think it can be. I think the developments in the peace in the Middle East, the Abraham Accords, the normalization of relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia, which was in progress and was one of the reasons why Iran directed this attack to happen, to stop that normalization from taking place. But all of these things, I think, are extremely constructive. They add to a climate in which people in Gaza and in the Palestinian Authority areas can see that it's possible for Israel and their Arab brothers in the UAE, in Saudi Arabia and other places to live in some kind of harmony. And if they can see that and they can see the advantages of that for themselves, then I think that's a way of persuading them to maybe begin to think that the propaganda they're subjected to and the indoctrination is not real. I'm not too optimistic about that, but I think that's probably one of the only ways that it can be done, and it's again quite a long-term process.
Do you think that the abundance of video materials that are now available after the tragedy that happened on 7th of October will change the situation in any way? Because as far as I know, the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine of 2022 was called the first TikTok war, because it was the first war that was actually documented, not only from the perspective of the journalists, but also from the perspective of those who were actively participating in the military actions. And on one hand, it feels like I wouldn't call it a good thing because war is never good, but it's an interesting thing, it's an interesting development, because now it's so much easier to trace people, it's so much easier to understand who you have to go after, for example, in case of terrorists specifically. But on the other hand, coming back to the film that we mentioned previously, do you think that the fact that those materials became so widely available, despite the censorship, and for the record, I think that censorship is very much needed in these things, not only from the respect to those who've fallen, but also because I don't think that people who are not prepared mentally should be able to see that. Do you think that the fact that world can now see what actually happened there and not rely on whatever we are trying to show from our side, or what the terrorists are trying to put out as and spread even as their propaganda, do you think it helps or it would make the situation worse?
I think it works from both directions, and one, you mentioned two things. One, that we shouldn't show this. There should be some censorship from the point of view of those who were killed and the families, etc. And secondly, people who are not ready to see this sort of thing. But the other dimension is people who want to see these things. And let's not forget, Islamic State, like Hamas, which have such a lot in common, they filmed, recorded, put out as propaganda their horrors that they committed. They were burning people in cages, things like this, torturing people, chopping people's heads off. They videoed it and put it out, and that encouraged some of their supporters to follow them. And that's the other danger of this, of these videos, is that it encourages people who are inclined towards jihad to follow that path. And I've seen plenty of video clips of people seeing this stuff and cheering. Any right-thinking person is horrified by that, but of course, many of these people don't think in the same way as we do. So I think it does bring home to many people the realities of war that they don't perhaps see through the normal media prism, and that can create horror in people's minds. And the problem is, if you've got a fixed position on something, almost whatever you see on a video of the reality doesn't necessarily change your mind. And on the 7th of October, I think a lot of people were absolutely shocked and horrified by what they saw happening inside Israel. And still, many of those people are now blaming Israel for it, because they've been indoctrinated, they've been conditioned over such a long period of time. And now that Israel is defending its people against this and to prevent it from happening again, they are still blaming Israel for what happened. So, and accusing Israel of war crimes. So it's a mixed situation, I would say.
Following that concept, I would say, we've seen an absolutely unprecedented rise of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and honestly, the former is probably way scarier than the latter, just because I understand, albeit of course I do not agree, why people could not like Israel, but the idea of not liking or wishing to kill or going to other extremes just based on someone's ethnic or religious basis is just so ridiculous to me, because I've studied in London for 4 years. I loved London, not only because it's one of the best cities in the world in my opinion, but also just because there were so many different people from so many different backgrounds, from so many different religions, ethnicities, and so on. And to see news about such large and honestly painful protests, which are supposed to be pro-Palestine, but they're in reality, from what I can tell, of course I haven't been there, I'm here in Israel, they're not pro-Palestine, they're pro-Hamas. And there's a very big difference, because as far as I'm aware, there were people who were like, free Palestine from Hamas. And that should be the end goal, because I truly believe that civilians should be saved on both sides. But do you think that there is a chance to change this perspective of anti-Semitism in the West, in the UK specifically? And how can we here in Israel affect the situation and make it better?
Well, the first thing I'd say to that is that anti-Semitism is anti-Zionism, and anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. They're one and the same thing. Zionism means only one thing, which is the existence, the development, and the progress of the state of Israel, a Jewish state. And if you object to a Jewish state, then you are by definition anti-Semitic. If you obviously there can be policies of the Jewish state you don't like, but generally speaking, the people who we're talking about, who are marching through London shouting from the river to the sea, that means they want to destroy the Jewish state. That is anti-Semitism. And this is not pro-Palestinian. These are not people who are protesting against the deaths of innocent Palestinian civilians inside Gaza. They're protesting about Israel's right to defend itself. And if you think back to the horrors and the mass deaths of Muslims in Syria, in Iraq, and in other places, where were the protests then against Muslims killing Muslims? The fact that it's Israel defending itself is what they're protesting about, and that is anti-Semitism. And I think all of this stems from what we've seen is the results. We've seen sort of 300,000 or 800,000, whatever the claims are, of marches last weekend through London. This is and protests and attacks against Jews on university campuses in the US, the UK, other European countries, and in their communities. All of this is the result of decades and decades of anti-Israel propaganda. And the propaganda, the campaign is not really aimed so much at Israel. It sounds strange, but it's not. It's aimed at the Jewish diaspora. This hate campaign, which our former Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, rightly characterised as that, hate marches, this is intended to intimidate Jews in London. That's the purpose. They know they can't do anything about Israel, nothing they can do to influence what Israel's doing. So it's about intimidating, undermining, attacking Jews. Why? Because Jews are the strongest supporters of the state of Israel. They're the ones who politicians take note of sometimes when they decide on the policies about supporting Israel or not. And so they want to undermine Jews' support for Israel. And unfortunately, they're often very successful in doing that. And you see on university campuses, Jews are afraid to wear their Star of David. They're afraid to wear their kippah. They take their mezuzah down from the door sometimes, even on university campuses, because they're intimidated. And this is what it's all about. It's an attack on the Jewish diaspora. And as to what Israel can do about it, well, I would say Israel can't do anything about it, because Israel has an obligation. People talk about Israel's right to defend its people. Israel doesn't have a right to defend its people. There's an absolute duty, like every country, to defend its people, and it must do so. The only way that Israel can defend its people from Hamas is not to have negotiations, have peace talks, nothing like that, because it doesn't work. We've seen it countless times. All Israel can do is to destroy Hamas, to destroy the entity that's trying to kill its people, as indeed we took major steps to destroy the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, and in Britain destroy the Irish Republican Army, which was carrying out terrorist attacks against Britain. And that's the way you do it. And unfortunately, in that process, civilians do die, because Hamas and other terrorist organizations use those civilians as their human shields. They hide behind the civilian population. And the reason they do it is very simple. It's not even predominantly to protect their fighters from the IDF. It's so that the IDF kill innocent civilians. They are determined that the IDF should kill innocent civilians. Why? So again, they can fuel these hate marches, so they can get resolutions in the United Nations, they can get university professors, they can get human rights groups to condemn Israel for killing innocent civilians. The reality is that Israel does everything it possibly can, to avoid killing civilians. But you can't avoid it if you're going to take care of the enemies that threaten your people. Israel has broadcast over 1 million, or more than several million, text messages, phone calls, voice messages, leaflets, to warn people to leave areas that they're going to attack. You can't really do much more than that, and it's more than most countries would ever do.
So, considering that Israel is already fulfilling its duty to prevent civilian casualties to the utmost extent, which I also think should be should be noted by international humanitarian law, because the claims that I've seen from international organizations, including the Committee for the Red Cross, were interesting, to say the least. I will try not to be completely impolite, but it's a rather hard task, if I'm being honest. But when I've studied in London from 2016 to 2019, I myself had, I would call it problems with the Friends of Palestine Society in my university. And with some of them, we were able to have a proper dialogue. We were, of course, not really agreeing on stuff, but it wasn't with hatred. It wasn't with, I dislike you and I hope the worst for you just because of your ethnicity or origins or anything else. But with some of them, it kind of came to an extent that when we had a class in Middle Eastern politics, my lecturer, who was a very sweet, petite woman, stood like that between me and the president of the society. And I'm just curious to know your opinion of what, I don't know, maybe the UK could do to change the perspective of the civilians, because generally the United Kingdom and the State of Israel always enjoyed, I would say, a pretty good relationship, especially considering historical perspective.
Yeah, I mean, the most important thing the UK can do is to do what it's doing now, which is stand up for Israel, to defend Israel's actions. What does annoy me sometimes, going back to the previous point, what does annoy me all the time, in fact, is when I hear politicians like Rishi Sunak and President Biden and the UN Secretary General and other people calling on Israel to respect the laws of war, to minimize civilian casualties. They know that's what Israel does. They know that. They've been briefed on it in great detail. They know exactly that's the situation. They're not saying it because they think suddenly Israel is going to change its way of operating because they've suggested it. They're saying it in order to appease those people who hate Israel and who don't support their policies. And by doing that, they're implying that Israel is not adhering to the laws of war. They're not doing everything they can to minimize civilian casualties. And that is playing directly into Hamas's agenda. So I think with that caveat, I would say that the UK is very strongly supporting Israel, and that's the best thing it can do to show that the democratically elected government of Britain stands up and agrees with what Israel's doing, and that's very important. Beyond that, I think steps should be taken, much firmer steps should be taken to deal with people on university campuses and organizations on university campuses that demonize Israel and that spread false propaganda about Israel. This is very important, and it's allowed to happen far too often. And where it's happening, on university campuses it's happening, there should be consideration given to defunding these campuses if they allow this sort of hate speech and propaganda to prevail. That's really important. And this is a climate that exists on, I would say, on most university campuses in the UK and in the US. And for example, I spoke at a university recently, the University of Essex, which had an Islamic society, it had a Sikh society, I think. They attempted to ban a Jewish society, not a pro-Israel, but a Jewish society. So this is the kind of activism that exists, and it should be clamped down upon much more by the government.
That part is actually not scripted, but I'm genuinely just very curious on which grounds have they attempted to do that. How could they justify it?
Well, there is no justification, and as it turned out, after a period of time, it was overturned and the Jewish society was established. But the fact they attempted to ban the Jewish society tells you everything you need to know.
Actually, yes, that's scary, because I hope that one day when I will have my own kids, my kids will not have to be afraid of who they are, and they will not have to be afraid of the religion that they were brought up, if they will decide to follow that religion, or by their country of origin, or by their passport. And that actually leads me to my next question. What do you think we should have learned, and to what we should pay the utmost attention in the State of Israel? And I'm not I don't want to discuss intelligence perspective because I personally don't think that I'm qualified, and I don't want to waste your time on that, speaking with someone who's not qualified. But I would be very interested just from the perspective of how should we deal with Hamas as a terrorist organization, with propaganda that they're spreading and stuff like that. Because, of course, we are enjoying the support of many people in the West and in the East as well. But maybe we could do something else. Maybe we should educate people more on what Israel actually is, and try to destroy the stereotypes that have existed for hundreds of years at this point.
Well, there's a lot of actions taken by the State of Israel and by Israel's supporters around the world, and there are very many of them, both particularly Jews, but also quite a large number of non-Jews, who are actively working to try and get the truth to people. Mm-hmm. And the truth includes both the truth about what the enemies of Israel do and why they do it and how they do it, and also about the way Israel operates, the good things Israel does, whether it's on the intelligence, military, or whatever front, or economic, or anything else, technological. There's a lot of action taking place on that, and has been for many years, but it has very, very limited effect because the enemy is so massive in its anti-Israel propaganda campaign. It started, actually, the whole anti-Israel propaganda campaign started in Russia in the 1960s, in the Kremlin. It was the KGB who wrote the Palestinian National Charter in the first place and created the whole situation that's being faced today, and that was one of the most effective Soviet propaganda campaigns in the history of the world, and it's turned into probably the greatest slur campaign the world's ever seen against Israel, and the massive amount of resources that go into that, funded by the Middle East, funded again still in Russia, funded in China, funded by countries that not just against Israel. And the important thing to note here is that this campaign in the Kremlin was not focused on undermining Israel. It was focused on undermining the United States and the United Kingdom in the Middle East. And there's still an element of that, still a very big element of that, where a lot of the anti-Israel propaganda is anti-American as well. That's the whole point of it, the whole purpose of a lot of it. And when you've got that kind of massive propaganda campaign, it's very hard to counter. Now, a lot of good work happens, as I said, and a lot of good work should continue, but you're simply not going to overcome this. There's a saying that the fact that there's a problem doesn't mean there's a solution. And I don't see any solution to this. I do think the really important thing is governments, Western governments, democratic governments, standing strong in support of Israel, and they don't always do that, including the British government. And the other key area I think that does need to be addressed, and I don't have a solution for it, is the United Nations. The United Nations is one of the most important anti-Israel organs in the world. It facilitates, it fuels, it drives, and people look at the UN and say, well, the UN says this, therefore it must be right. So somehow that should be addressed. I don't know, I don't have the answer as to how, but the UN is one of the biggest problems in this whole equation.
I have to agree, based on both the recent Security Council's meetings and by the general outlook, and especially based on the recent statements of the Secretary General of the UN. But I believe that would be a topic for another video, just because there is so much to unpack. I think I only have one question left, which is, I think, once again, more about morale. If you would have to address a bunch of high schoolers, university students, doesn't really matter, but people who are 22, 23, who either just finished the army, because we're speaking about Israel, or about to go to the army, what would you say to them?
I'd like to answer that in two parts. And first of all, those people who are going to the army in Israel. I've met many IDF soldiers on the border with Lebanon and on the border with Gaza in recent days, and I've been inspired by their dedication, their bravery, and their determination to defend their people. And these, in many cases, very young soldiers who, you know, in ordinary circumstances would probably be at university now. And it's actually humbling to watch what they do. And so anyone who's about to join the IDF or to fight for their country, I would say that it's an extremely important thing you're doing. It does take courage, but it is, unfortunately, in the circumstances we live in, it is absolutely essential to protect and defend your families, friends, and your homeland. And you know, I understand the challenges that you face, but you have to bite the bullet and go ahead and do it, and you should be proud to do it. As far as people outside Israel are concerned, and this applies first of all to non-Jews, I would say, don't just let if you're a Jewish student, so you're a non-Jewish student on a university campus, don't just stand by and watch Jews being abused in the way they are. Don't just watch the lies being told, but stand up with them, stand for them. If you're a decent, right-thinking person, then you should be alongside them as well. And as for Jewish students, Jews and non-Jews actually, the Holocaust to some extent began on university campuses in Germany, and the demonization of Jews that took place there, even before it became Nazi government policy, Jews were still being demonized on university campuses. And I'm not suggesting this is going to lead to another Holocaust, but it is increasingly leading to gross anti-Semitism, and therefore people have to do something about it. In the 1930s in Germany, people were silent. People didn't stand up and say anything, with very, very few exceptions. And now we're seeing what's happening. We're seeing the demonization of Israel. We're seeing the demonization of Jews. Jews and non-Jews should be standing up against that. And I think I would say one thing to Jewish students: it's particularly hard for them because they're the ones who are in the eye of the storm. They're the ones that are getting attacked. They have to be courageous. They have to show some form of bravery. They're probably not going to get physically attacked, but they're going to be attacked on social media. They're going to be maybe had bad things said about them, but they should put that aside and stand up, because what they're standing up for is they're standing up for their families. If it's not stopped, if this is not staunched, then their families are going to be under increasing pressure. They're standing up for their religion. They're standing up for their people. They're standing up for the Jewish state. And again, it's not something that they should take on as a burden and think this is something terrible. It's something they should be honored to do. We'd rather it didn't happen, but it is happening. And many people in the past have had the courage and bravery to stand up and actually risk their life. So what we're asking today is to have the courage to stand up and risk maybe some abuse on Facebook or something like that.
I just want to finish it with the main picture that probably made my week. There is a picture circulating on the internet of an Israeli soldier who is sitting, I'm not sure whether it was a tank or just some heavy machinery, and playing a violin. And I think it kind of symbolizes the Jewish state right now, because we want peace, and we will get peace. But if we have to defend ourselves, we will. And I just, in some sense, I think that's beautiful, because of all the stereotypes that we had to deal with for so many years, for so many centuries. And with all the stereotypes, specifically in the West, of like Jews not being able to defend themselves and only playing violins. Well, we still continue to play violins. We just do it on tanks now. Thank you so much, Colonel. Thank you for your time. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Likewise.